"I am sick of your face," he said, his voice a low grumble that soured the air in the morning room. Lord Ashworth, my stepfather, did not look at me. His eyes were fixed on the financial ledgers spread across his mahogany desk, a landscape of ink and numbers that held far more interest for him than the flesh and blood of his household. The words were not a sudden outburst, but a statement of fact, delivered with the same dispassionate finality as a judge sentencing a prisoner. "Then close your eyes," I replied. The words left my lips before I could stop them, a whisper of defiance in the oppressive silence. They were small stones thrown against a fortress wall, and I expected them to fall away unnoticed. He did not move, but the scratching of his quill ceased. A dangerous quiet descended, thick and heavy like velvet curtains smothering a scream. I held my breath, my heart a frantic bird beating against the cage of my ribs. Slowly, deliberately, he placed his pen in its stand. He still did not look at me. He simply closed his eyes. In that sliver of an instant, that brief eclipse of his condescending gaze, I was gone. I did not run. I evaporated. I moved with the practiced silence of a ghost, my worn slippers making no sound on the polished floorboards. I slipped through the door he had left ajar and fled down the long, cold corridor, the portraits of his ancestors watching my retreat with painted indifference. I did not stop until I reached the library's farthest corner, a forgotten alcove behind a towering shelf of theological texts no one had touched in a century. There, in the dusty twilight, I sank to the floor, my back pressed against the unread words of forgotten men, and I wept. I was Ilara, a footnote in the grand story of the Ashworth family. My mother had died when I was a child, leaving me with a small but significant dowry, and a father who dissolved into a creature of quiet acquiescence. His second marriage, to the formidable Lady Beatrice Ashworth, had been a pragmatic one, and she had brought with her a daughter, Rosamond. Rosamond was the sun around which our household revolved. She was everything I was not, radiant, vivacious, and breathtakingly beautiful. Her laughter was like wind chimes, they said. My silence was like the dust motes that danced in the slivers of light piercing the library's gloom. My stepmother did not hate me with passion. That would have required an acknowledgement of my existence as a person. Instead, she regarded me as an unfortunate piece of furniture left behind by the previous owner, inconvenient, plain, and taking up valuable space. My father, a man hollowed out by grief and fear of confrontation, simply pretended I was not there. It was easier for him, and so I learned the color of invisibility. It was the pale gray of my dresses, the faded brown of my hair, the quiet beige of my disposition. I learned to walk the edges of rooms, to breathe more shallowly when others entered, to make myself smaller and smaller, until I was nothing but a shadow. My only refuge was this library. It was a world of paper and ink, of lives lived and battles fought and love declared, all safely contained between leather-bound covers. My particular solace was a collection of aging botanical texts. In their pages, I found a silent, ordered world of breathtaking complexity. I learned the language of petals and stems, the secret architecture of a leaf's veins, the defiant beauty of a wildflower pushing its way through a crack in a stone wall. I began to draw them, my charcoal and pencils moving with a precision and care I could never muster in the real world. My drawings were my only voice, the only part of me that was not muted and gray. They were vibrant, detailed, and alive. They were everything I was not allowed to be. The upcoming annual solstice ball was a source of immense stress in our house. For my stepmother, it was the pinnacle of the social season, a battlefield where alliances were forged and advantageous matches were made. For Rosamond, it was a stage upon which to shine. For me, it was an ordeal to be survived. This year, the stakes were higher than ever. The Duke of Alistair Vance was rumored to be in attendance. He was a figure of almost mythical proportions, impossibly wealthy, terrifyingly powerful, and a recluse who had not attended a social gathering in nearly a decade. His presence would turn the ball from a notable event into a legendary one. Lady Ashworth was a general preparing for war. Gowns were commissioned, jewels were brought out from the vault, and the house was in a constant state of frantic preparation. A week before the ball, a dressmaker arrived with a mountain of silk and lace for Rosamond. The fabric was the color of a dawn sky, shimmering with silver thread. It was a dress made for a princess. "And for Alara," my stepmother said, her voice dripping with magnanimity that was purely for the dressmaker's benefit. "We shall have to find something suitable. Something quiet." She gestured to a bolt of fabric in a shade of indeterminate brownish gray, the color of dishwater. "This will do. Simple, unobtrusive." The dressmaker, a woman with tired eyes, took my measurements with a perfunctory air. She knew my place in this house. The resulting gown was as expected. It fit, but it did not flatter. It was a uniform for a ghost, designed to blend into the shadows and tapestries of the ballroom. When I tried it on, Rosamond looked at me with a flicker of something that might have been pity. "It is very modest, Alara," she offered, her own reflection shimmering like a celestial body in the mirror beside me. "It is what Mother wishes," I said, my voice flat. There was no point in arguing. My purpose at the ball was not to be seen, but to be present, a silent testament to the Ashworths' supposed generosity in housing their plain, unwanted ward. On the night of the ball, my stepmother gave me my final instructions. She stood before me, a magnificent galleon in sapphire silk, her diamonds like chips of ice. "You will remain in the alcove by the east terrace doors. It is a quiet spot. You may sit if you find a chair. Do not wander. Do not engage anyone in conversation unless you are spoken to first. And for heaven's sake, try not to look so morose. You are a reflection on this family." My father stood nearby, adjusting his cravat, his eyes studiously avoiding mine. He heard her words, the casual cruelty of my public imprisonment, and said nothing. His silence was the heaviest stone on my heart. The ballroom was a galaxy of light and sound. Hundreds of candles burned in the crystal chandeliers, their light fracturing into 1,000 rainbows. The orchestra played a soaring waltz, and the air was thick with the scent of beeswax, perfume, and champagne. I slipped away to my designated prison, a small, shadowed recess between two towering marble columns. From there, I could see the whole glittering spectacle without being a part of it. I watched Rosamond, a vision in her dawn sky gown, immediately surrounded by a flock of admirers. I watched my stepmother navigate the crowd with the predatory grace of a shark, her smile sharp and brilliant. I was a stone at the bottom of a river, watching the vibrant fish swim by overhead, oblivious to my existence, and I was content with that. Being unseen was a form of safety. It was the sharp sting of being seen, of being judged and found wanting, that I could not bear. An hour passed, then another. The heat and noise of the room began to feel suffocating. I focused on the details around me to keep from fading entirely. I studied the intricate plasterwork on the ceiling, a breathtaking display of acanthus leaves in geometric patterns. I had read about it in a book from the library. The architect had used a novel cantilever system to support the central dome, a feat of engineering that was as beautiful as it was brilliant. It was a secret wonder hidden in plain sight, and I felt a strange kinship with it. Then, a ripple went through the crowd. The music faltered for a half-beat. A wave of whispers spread from the grand entrance, and a pathway seemed to magically clear through the dense throng of people. He had arrived. The Duke of Alistair Vance was not what I had expected. He was not a fairy tale prince, nor was he a gnarled old troll guarding his treasure. He was tall and severe, dressed in immaculate black that seemed to absorb the light around him. His face was all sharp angles and stark planes, as if carved from granite, and his eyes were a pale, piercing gray that missed nothing. There was a stillness about him that was more commanding than any loud declaration. He moved through the ballroom not as a guest, but as its master, the gravitational center around which everything else was forced to orbit. My stepmother was on him in an instant, her smile wide and welcoming. He inclined his head, a gesture of politeness so minimal it was almost an insult. He spoke a few curt words to his host, my stepfather, who seemed to shrink in his presence. Then he began to survey the room, his gaze sweeping over the glittering assembly with an expression of profound boredom. His eyes passed over Rosamond and her coterie without a flicker of interest. They scanned the dancers, the dowagers, the fortune hunters. And then they stopped. On me. He was looking directly at me, tucked away in my shadowy alcove. It was not a casual glance. It was a look of intense, focused scrutiny, as if he were trying to solve a complex puzzle. I froze, my blood turning to ice. I felt utterly exposed, a nocturnal creature caught in a sudden beam of light. I wanted to shrink into the marble column behind me, to melt into the floor. I dropped my gaze, my cheeks burning with a heat that had nothing to do with the stuffy ballroom. But he did not look away. I could feel the weight of his stare. A terrible silence seemed to expand from my corner of the room. People began to notice. They followed his line of sight, their curious glances landing on me like a swarm of insects. I heard a titter of laughter. Who was he looking at? That drab little mouse in the corner? Then, to the astonishment of every single person in that room, he began to walk. He did not stroll or meander. He moved with a direct and unnerving purpose, his path cutting straight through the heart of the ballroom floor. Dancers scrambled to get out of his way. Conversations died in mid-sentence. The orchestra faltered again, the melody thinning to a nervous whisper of strings. He walked past my stepmother, who watched him with a look of utter bewilderment. He walked past Rosamond, whose perfect smile had frozen on her face. He walked until he was standing directly in front of me, his shadow falling over me like a sudden twilight. The entire world seemed to hold its breath. I could not look up. I stared at the polished toes of his black boots, praying for the floor to open up and swallow me whole. "You are hiding," he said. His voice was not loud, but it was deep and resonant, cutting through the silence with absolute clarity. It was not a question. It was a statement. I dared a glance upward. His face was unreadable, a mask of aristocratic severity. "I was instructed to remain here, Your Grace," I whispered, my voice thin and reedy. He gave a short, dismissive nod, as if that explained everything. His gaze lifted from me for a moment, flicking up to the ceiling above our heads. "The cantilevered dome," he said, his voice retaining that same quiet intensity. "It was designed by Sir Christopher Wren's lesser-known protégé, Julian Croft. He used a double-shell construction to distribute the weight, a technique he adapted from studying the anatomy of bird skulls. Most people assume it is merely decorative." My head snapped up. My shock was so profound it eclipsed my terror. How could he possibly know that? It was a detail buried in the most obscure architectural treatise in our library. Without thinking, I replied, "They mistake engineering for ornamentation. The true beauty is in the mathematics that hold it aloft, not the plasterwork that conceals it." For the first time, a flicker of something shifted in his granite expression. It was not a smile, but the ghost of one, a subtle easing of the tension around his mouth. "Indeed," he said softly. His gaze dropped back to me, and it was different now. The piercing scrutiny had been replaced by something else, something I could not name. It felt like recognition. He extended a gloved hand. "You've been hidden in this corner long enough. Walk with me." It was a command, not a request. To refuse would be an unthinkable breach of etiquette. To accept felt like stepping off a cliff. My hand trembled as I placed it in his. His grip was firm and cool. He drew me out of the shadows and into the blazing light of the ballroom. A collective gasp seemed to pass through the room. I felt hundreds of pairs of eyes on me, sharp and incredulous. My stepmother's face was a mask of fury and disbelief. Rosamond looked simply lost. The Duke paid them no mind. He led me in a slow circuit of the room, his presence a formidable shield around me. He did not speak again of architecture. Instead, he asked me about the books I read. He asked me what I thought of the Stoic philosophers, of the latest discoveries in botany from the New World. He asked questions no one had ever asked me, questions that presumed I had a mind and thoughts of my own. And I answered. My voice, at first a hesitant tremor, grew steadier. I spoke of things I had only ever debated with myself in the silence of the library. He listened, his head inclined, his strange, intense eyes never leaving my face. It was the most terrifying and exhilarating experience of my life. I felt as though I had been living my entire life in a dark, silent room, and someone had just thrown open the door, flooding it with sunlight and sound. When our turn about the room was complete, he led me not back to my corner, but to a set of chairs near the orchestra. He procured 2 glasses of lemonade and sat with me, continuing our conversation as if we were the only 2 people in the world. The rest of the ball, the most important social event of the year, simply ceased to exist for us. For him, it was a deliberate choice. For me, it was a miracle. I returned home that night in a daze, my mind reeling. My stepmother was incandescent with rage. "What was the meaning of that spectacle?" she hissed, cornering me in the hall. "What tricks did you play? He was supposed to notice Rosamond." "I played no tricks," I said, my voice still holding a trace of its newfound confidence. "He spoke to me." I answered. "Do not be impertinent," she snapped. "It was a fluke. A moment of bizarre eccentricity on his part. It means nothing. Do you understand me?" "Nothing." I understood. But as I lay in my bed that night, I could not quell the tiny, dangerous flicker of hope that had been ignited in my chest. For the first time in my life, I had not been invisible. Someone had looked past the gray dress and the quiet demeanor and had seen me, and he was not just anyone. He was the Duke of Alastair Vance. The next afternoon, a footman in the Duke's livery arrived at our door. He did not carry a bouquet of flowers or a box of chocolates. He carried a single heavy leather-bound book. It was a first edition of Croft's treatise on architectural engineering. Tucked inside was a card. On it, in a stark black script, were only a few words. "So the beauty is not concealed from everyone." A V below, it was an invitation to view the library at his estate, Blackwood Manor, the following day. My stepmother tried to intercept the invitation, claiming it must be a mistake, that it was surely intended for Rosamond, but the footman was firm. "The Duke was most specific, my lady. The book and the invitation are for Mistress Alara." Lady Ashworth was forced to concede, but her eyes were cold with suspicion. "Be very careful, Alara," she warned me in a low voice. "Men like the Duke do not trifle with girls like you for noble reasons. He is amusing himself. Do not make a fool of yourself, and more importantly, do not make a fool of this family." I tried to believe her. I tried to convince myself that this was all just a rich man's whim, a fleeting curiosity. Hope was a dangerous thing, a fragile seedling that could be crushed underfoot in an instant. It was safer to remain in the barren soil of my resignation. But as I held the heavy book in my hands, tracing the gold-leaf title with my fingertips, I could not stop the seedling from pushing its way toward the light. Blackwood Manor was less a house and more a force of nature. It rose from the windswept moors, a fortress of dark gray stone that seemed to have grown from the very bedrock of the earth. It was imposing and severe, a perfect reflection of its master. A stern, white-haired housekeeper named Mistress Gable met me at the door. Her expression was as starched and formal as her uniform. She led me through halls of echoing stone and shadowed portraits to the library, and I stopped breathing. It was not a room, it was a cathedral dedicated to the written word. 2 stories of floor-to-ceiling shelves soared upwards, connected by a delicate wrought-iron spiral staircase. A vast fireplace dominated one wall, and the air smelled of old paper, leather, and wood smoke. Sunlight streamed through a Palladian window, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air like tiny golden sprites. The Duke was standing by that window, silhouetted against the light. "I see it meets with your approval," he said, his voice softer in this quiet space. "It is the most beautiful room I have ever seen," I breathed, my heart aching with a strange sense of homecoming. "My father built it," he said, turning to face me. "He believed that a house without a proper library was not a home, but merely a place to sleep." He gestured to the chairs by the fire. "Please." Mistress Gable appeared with a tray of tea and biscuits, and then vanished as silently as she had arrived. I sat on the edge of a deep leather armchair, feeling small and out of place. The Duke did not sit, but paced slowly before the fire, his hands clasped behind his back. "I must confess, Your Grace," I began, my voice trembling slightly. "I do not understand why you have invited me here." He stopped pacing and looked at me. "Do you remember the funeral of old Lord Albright 5 years ago?" The question was so unexpected, it threw me off balance. Yes, of course. It had been a dreary, rain-soaked affair. "The church was filled with people performing their grief," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. weeping into their handkerchiefs, speaking in hushed, reverent tones about a man most of them despised. It was a pageant of hypocrisy. I was standing in the back, near the door, preparing to leave the moment it was socially acceptable. He paused, his gaze sharpening. But you were not watching the sermon. You were not watching the other mourners. You were looking out the stained glass window at the ancient yew tree in the churchyard. You had a small sketchbook, and you were drawing the way its branches twisted against the gray sky. Everyone else was performing an emotion. You were documenting a truth. I stared at him, my mind reeling. I remembered that day. I had been 15. The hypocrisy of the mourners had felt suffocating, and the stoic, enduring presence of the old tree had been the only honest thing in the church. I had sketched it to anchor myself, to find a small piece of reality in a sea of pretense. I never imagined anyone had noticed. You see things, Mistress Alara, he continued, his voice low. You see the engineering behind the ornamentation. You see the tree instead of the pageant. I find that rare. My carefully constructed walls of cynicism and self-protection began to crumble. He was not amusing himself. This was not a whim. He had seen me. He had seen me 5 years ago, a lonely girl sketching a tree. And he had remembered. The realization was so overwhelming that I felt tears prick at my eyes. I blinked them back fiercely. I would not cry in front of him. That's a kind thing to say, Your Grace, I managed. It is not kindness, he corrected me, his tone precise. It is an observation. We spent the next 2 hours in that library. He showed me his collection of botanical illustrations, exquisite works from the great masters, and he listened with genuine interest as I spoke of my own humble attempts. We argued about the merits of Rousseau versus Locke. We spoke of the quiet, patient world of books and ideas, a world we both clearly preferred to the glittering hollow one of the ballroom. In his presence, I was not the plain, silent Alara. I was a person with a mind, an equal. When it was time for me to leave, Mistress Gable reappeared to escort me out. As I stood to go, she placed a warm woolen shawl around my shoulders. The evenings on the moor are deceptively cold, miss, she said, her stern face softening for a fraction of a second. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a benediction. That visit was the first of many. Sometimes he would send a carriage for me to come to Blackwood. Other times he would appear at my own home, requesting my company for a walk in the gardens, much to my stepmother's barely concealed fury. Our meetings were always perfectly proper, often chaperoned at a distance by Mistress Gable or one of my own family's reluctant servants. But the conversations we had were anything but conventional. We built a world between us, a world made of words and ideas. He spoke of his travels, of the stark beauty of the northern highlands and the chaotic vibrancy of Italian cities. And he drew me out, asking me to articulate my own quiet philosophies, my observations on the natural world. He made me feel that my thoughts, which I had always considered worthless and uninteresting, had value. One afternoon, as we sat in his library during a raging thunderstorm, he told me about his brother. His name was Thomas, and he had been 5 years younger than Alistair. He was bright and fearless and adored his older brother. They had been racing their horses along the cliffs. Alistair, always more cautious, had warned him to slow down. Thomas, in a fit of youthful bravado, had spurred his horse faster. The animal had stumbled on the slick grass. I watched him fall, the Duke said, his voice raw and stripped of all its usual control. He was staring into the fire, but I knew he was seeing the cliff, the gray sky, the fall. I was the older brother. I was supposed to protect him. My parents never blamed me, not in words. But their silence was an accusation I heard every day until they died. He fell silent, the grief a tangible presence in the room. In that moment, he was not the powerful, severe Duke of Alistair Vance. He was a man haunted by a ghost, a man who had walled himself away from the world to serve a self-imposed penance. Without thinking, I reached out and laid my hand over his where it rested on the arm of his chair. It was a shocking breach of decorum. His hand was tense, coiled like a spring, but he did not pull away. He slowly turned his hand over and laced his fingers through mine. His touch was a jolt, a current of heat and life that ran straight to my heart. We sat there for a long time, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the drumming of the rain against the window panes, his hand holding mine as if it were a lifeline. It was a turning point. The careful distance we had maintained was dissolving. The air between us grew thick with unspoken things. A glance held a moment too long, a shared silence that was more intimate than any conversation. Once, while we were examining a rare orchid in his conservatory, he looked at me, and his face was transformed by a near smile. It was a breathtaking sight, like witnessing a sunrise over a granite mountain. My world, once so small and gray, was expanding, filling with color and warmth and a terrifying, brilliant hope. But such a change could not go unnoticed. My stepmother watched our growing connection with the eyes of a hawk. The Duke's attention on me was a direct threat to her ambitions for Rosamond. She had envisioned her daughter as a duchess, the mistress of Blackwood Manor. My unexpected ascendance from family ghost to the Duke's chosen companion was an intolerable turn of events. She began a campaign of subtle sabotage. My invitations from the Duke would go missing. Messages would be misplaced. She would fill my days with tedious, time-consuming chores to prevent me from being free when he called. But the Duke was not a man to be so easily deterred. If a letter went unanswered, he would simply appear in person. If I was occupied, he would wait, his silent, imposing presence disrupting the entire household until I was made available. His persistence only fueled my stepmother's desperation. She saw that her petty obstacles were failing, and so she decided to escalate her attack. She chose a weapon she knew I was defenseless against: my reputation. One morning, I was summoned to my stepfather's study. Lady Ashworth was there, her face a mask of false concern. My father looked deeply uncomfortable. "Alara, my dear," she began, her voice syrupy sweet, "your father and I have been so worried about you. This attachment to the Duke, it is not healthy. He is a man of the world, and you are an innocent. He is merely toying with you, and it will end in heartbreak and scandal." "I do not believe that is true," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "Of course you don't, dear," she said with a patronizing sigh. "You are too naive to see it. That is why we have taken steps to protect you." She gestured to my father. He cleared his throat, unable to meet my eyes. "Baron Croft has made an offer of marriage," he mumbled, staring at his desk. "He is a respectable man. A bit older, but stable. It is a good match. It will secure your future." Baron Croft was a corpulent, lecherous old man with a reputation for cruelty to his staff and his previous 2 wives, both of whom had died under mysterious circumstances. The thought of marrying him was a nightmare. "No," I said, the word a raw gasp. "I will not." "It is not a request," my stepmother said, her voice turning to steel. The pretense of concern vanished, revealing the cold, hard ambition beneath. "The contracts have been drawn up. Your father has given his consent. You will marry the Baron at the end of the month. It is for the good of the family. The Duke will forget all about his little country mouse once she is safely married." Panic seized me, cold and suffocating. I looked at my father, pleading with my eyes. "Father, please, you cannot do this." He finally looked at me, his face a portrait of misery and weakness. "Beatrice is right, Alara. It is for the best. A quiet life is what you need." He was sacrificing me for his own quiet life, for freedom from his wife's relentless pressure. My last hope in him died, but my stepmother was not finished. She had a second, more venomous arrow in her quiver. "And to ensure there is no misunderstanding with his grace," she added, a cruel smile playing on her lips, "I have taken the liberty of writing to him myself. I explained that you are a troubled girl, prone to flights of fancy and melancholic delusions. I also hinted at an unfortunate and rather vulgar attachment you formed with one of our stable boys. A man of his stature cannot abide such scandal. He will not trouble you again." The cruelty of it was breathtaking. She was not just trapping me, she was methodically destroying the one good, true thing in my life. She was poisoning the well, ensuring that even if I could escape the Baron, the Duke would see me as nothing but a liar and a fool. I felt the world tilt on its axis, the color drained from my vision, and the small, hopeful seedling in my heart was ripped out by its roots. I turned and fled the room, her triumphant laughter echoing behind me. The days that followed were a blur of despair. I was a prisoner in my own home. I was not allowed to leave the house, and a guard was posted to ensure no messages got in or out. I waited for some word from the Duke, some sign that he had not believed her vicious lies, but there was only silence, a terrible, damning silence. My stepmother was right. He was a duke. Why would he believe me, a nobody, over the word of a lady of society? He had been amusing himself, and the game was over. The hope that had bloomed so brightly now left an aching, hollow void in its wake. The world reverted to its familiar shades of gray, but it was a darker, more hopeless gray than before. A week before the scheduled wedding to Baron Croft, a carriage bearing the Duke's crest rolled up our drive. It was not the Duke himself, but his man of business, a stern-looking lawyer who requested an immediate audience with my father and stepmother. I watched from my window, my heart a dead weight in my chest. He had come to formally sever ties, to express his disgust. My humiliation was about to be made complete. An hour later, my stepmother stormed into my room. Her face was pale with a rage so profound it seemed to vibrate. "What have you done?" she shrieked, her voice a raw, ragged thing. "What witchcraft have you worked on him?" I stared at her, uncomprehending. "The Duke!" she spat. "He has invited us all to Blackwood Manor this evening, for dinner. He wishes to discuss the marriage contracts. Yours and the Baron's." She grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in like talons. "You will not say a word. You will sit there and look contrite and grateful. If you ruin this, I will make you wish you had never been born." The journey to Blackwood was the longest of my life. I sat in the carriage, a condemned woman on her way to the gallows. My father was silent, his face ashen. My stepmother muttered to herself, plotting. Even Rosamond, who had been brought along as a show of family unity, seemed nervous, casting worried glances in my direction. We were shown not into the grand dining room, but into the library. A fire roared in the hearth, but the room felt cold. The Duke was standing before it, his back to us. He did not turn when we entered. His lawyer, Mr. Sterling, stood by a table laden with documents. Baron Croft was there as well, a bloated spider in garish purple silk, his piggy eyes fixing on me with a look of greedy ownership. "Lord Ashworth, Lady Ashworth, thank you for coming," the Duke said, finally turning. His face was carved from ice. His eyes were not angry. They were cold, possessed of a lethal calm that was far more terrifying. They swept over my family, over the Baron, and then they rested on me. For a fleeting second, just a second, the ice seemed to thaw, and I saw a flicker of something else, reassurance, and my heart gave a single painful lurch. "Your Grace," my stepmother began, her voice smooth as oil, "we were so pleased to receive your invitation. We are all so thrilled about dear Alara's match with the good Baron." "Are we?" the Duke interrupted, his voice cutting through her flattery like a shard of glass. He picked up a letter from the mantelpiece. "I received a letter from you, Lady Ashworth. A most illuminating letter. You paint a picture of a mentally unstable girl, prone to delusions and sordid affairs." Lady Ashworth paled. "I wrote out of concern, Your Grace, for the girl's own good." "Your concern is noted," the Duke said dryly. It was so profound, in fact, that it prompted me to make a few inquiries of my own. I have a great many people in my employ, you see. They are very discreet and very thorough. He gestured to Mr. Sterling. "My man of business has been reviewing certain financial records, specifically the trust left to Mistress Alara by her late mother, a trust which you, Lord Ashworth, have been administering." My father flinched as if struck. "It seems," the Duke continued, his voice dropping to a dangerously low level, "that for the past 10 years, significant sums have been systematically diverted from that trust, funds used for gowns, for jewels, for lavish parties, funds used to maintain a lifestyle you could not otherwise afford, funds that legally belong to Alara." My stepmother gasped. "These are outrageous lies." "Are they?" Mr. Sterling stepped forward and unrolled a ledger. "I have the bank records right here. The withdrawals coincide perfectly with every major purchase you have made for the last decade, my lady. It is not a lie, it is arithmetic." The Baron began to look agitated, sweating in his silk finery. "What has this to do with me? My contract is with Lord Ashworth." "Ah, yes, the contract," the Duke said, turning his cold gaze on the Baron. "A contract in which Lord Ashworth promises you Alara's hand, and with it her remaining dowry. A dowry which, my investigation reveals, you desperately need to settle your rather catastrophic gambling debts." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "However, since the bulk of her fortune has been stolen, the dowry you were promised no longer exists. Furthermore," he added, a predatory gleam in his eye, I believe your creditors would be most interested to learn of your current financial predicament. I took the liberty of purchasing your debts this morning, all of them. You, Baron, are ruined." The Baron's face turned a mottled shade of purple. He sputtered, speechless, and stumbled back into his chair. My stepmother, however, was a cornered animal. "You cannot prove any of this. It is her word against mine. She is a fantasist, a liar." The Duke looked at me then, a silent question in his eyes, and in that moment something broke inside me. The years of silence, of making myself small, of swallowing the casual cruelty and the soul-crushing indifference, it all shattered. A fire I never knew I possessed surged through my veins. I took a step forward. "No," I said, and my voice did not tremble. It was clear and strong and rang with the truth of a struck bell. "I am not the liar. For 10 years, you have treated me as less than nothing. I was a ghost in my own home. You told me I was plain, so I would believe I was worthless. You told me I was quiet, so I would not dare to speak. You stole my mother's legacy, and when that was not enough, you tried to sell me to this creature to be rid of me forever." I turned to my father. "And you," I said, my voice thick with a decade of pain. "You stood by and watched. You let her dim every light inside me because you were too weak to demand a moment's peace. Your silence was my prison." Tears were streaming down my face, but they were not tears of weakness. They were tears of rage and release. I faced my stepmother one last time. "You did not silence me. You only taught me to listen. And I heard everything, every whisper, every lie, every cruel dismissal. You tried to make me invisible, but you forgot that the invisible see everything." A profound silence filled the room. My stepmother stared at me, her mouth agape, her mask of civility finally shattered, revealing the ugly, grasping greed beneath. My father covered his face with his hands and let out a choked sob. Rosamond, who had been watching with wide, horrified eyes, walked over to me and took my hand. "I'm so sorry, Alara," she whispered. "I never knew." The Duke watched me, his expression unreadable, but his eyes burned with a fierce, proud light. He stepped forward, placing himself at my side. "The contracts for the Baron are void," he said, his voice a final judgment, "and criminal charges will be brought against you, Lady Ashworth, for theft and fraud. You will leave this house. You will leave all of your possessions as they were purchased with stolen money. You will leave with nothing but the clothes on your back." He looked at my father. "Unless you would prefer to join her in prison." My father shook his head, a broken man. My stepmother let out a strangled cry and lunged toward me, her face twisted with hate, but the Duke moved between us, a solid, immovable wall. She recoiled, defeated. Her reign was over. After they were gone, my stepmother dragged out by the Duke's men, my father and Rosamond departing in a shroud of shame and regret. A profound quiet settled over the library. I stood by the fire, trembling with the aftermath of the confrontation. I felt scoured clean, empty, but also strangely light. The Duke came to stand beside me. He did not speak for a long time. "You were magnificent," he said at last, his voice rough with an emotion I could not decipher. "You saved me," I whispered, looking into the flames. "No, Alara," he said, turning me gently to face him. He took my face in his hands, his thumbs stroking my cheeks, wiping away the last of my tears. "I did not save you. I merely provided the battlefield. You fought your own war. You always had that strength inside you. I just wanted the world to see it." His gaze was intense, stripping away all my defenses. "I do not wish to give you a voice. You have always had one. I only wish to be the one who gets to listen to it for the rest of my life." My heart stopped. "Alistair," I breathed, using his name for the first time. "I have loved you, I think, since I saw a 15-year-old girl choose to draw a gnarled tree instead of perform a pretty lie," he said, his voice thick with a vulnerability I had only glimpsed once before. "I have loved your mind, your integrity, your quiet defiance. I love the way you see the world. Marry me, Alara. Do not let me return to a life of silence." And then he lowered his head and kissed me. It was not a gentle, tentative kiss. It was a kiss of profound certainty, of finding a port after a lifetime at sea. It was the end of a very long winter, the breaking of a spell. It was the feeling of being at long last, completely and utterly seen. I wrapped my arms around his neck and kissed him back, pouring all the hope and pain and love I had kept locked away for a lifetime into that single, breathtaking moment. A year later, I stood on the windswept ridge overlooking Blackwood Manor. The autumn air was crisp, and the moors were a tapestry of russet and gold. I was no longer Alara Ashworth, the ghost in the gray dress. I was Alara Vance, Duchess of Alastair. I was a published illustrator, my folio of botanical drawings bound in fine green leather resting on the great table in the library where my husband and I spent most of our evenings. Alastair came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist and pulling me back against his chest. He rested his chin on my shoulder, his familiar warmth a comforting anchor against the wind. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his voice a low murmur against my ear. I smiled, leaning back into him. "I was thinking about the color of invisibility," I said. "I used to think it was gray, a washed out, faded, nothing color. And now?" he prompted. I turned in his arms to face him, my hands coming up to cup his jaw. I looked into his pale gray eyes, eyes that had once seemed so severe and cold, but which I now knew held more warmth and love than 1,000 summer suns. "Now," I said softly, "I know it does not exist. There are only those who are too blind to see." He smiled then, that rare, breathtaking smile that was mine alone, and he lowered his head to kiss me. And in the vast, quiet expanse of the moors, surrounded by the enduring strength of the land and the steadfast love of this man, I was more visible, more real than I had ever dared to dream. I was home,